Hello, I'm Oriana Fox. Thank you for tuning in to Multiple O's, the spin-off podcast for my talk show, The O Show. The O Show is a live performance piece that mines the conventions of daytime TV talk shows for all that they're worth. It features artists and other experts who have no difficulty spilling the beans about their lives and opinions, especially when they defy norms and conventions. So if you're interested in candid confessions, nonconformity, creativity, and mental health, you've come to the right place. Hello. Welcome to Multiple O's. I'm your host, Oriana. This is the spin-off podcast for The O Show, my talk show. And I'm going to begin with the ritual I perform at the start of every podcast, which is to flatter my guest in the hopes that will lead them to spilling the beans in the interview. So, I'm joined today by Harold Offeh, an artist whose work I greatly admire, and which shares affinities with my own. That is, he engages with identity politics via an ambivalent and humorous self-casting within the pop culture material he admires, and in some cases finds deeply problematic. But also, perhaps due to our closeness in age, he's almost exactly 1 year my senior, we also share a love of a certain color palette, an aesthetic undoubtedly born out of growing up in the neon glow of the 1980s. Harold's practice is manifold, encompassing cabaret acts, live art interventions, video art, installation, and social practice. Indeed, he's been very, very busy amassing a prolific output in these myriad media. But what intrigues me most, perhaps because I see this connection to my own work, is that he merges embodiment with appropriation. He explores identity politics, as I said already, via recreating images, placing himself into them, playing typecast roles, embodying stereotypes, and whilst messy confessional accounts are notably absent from his oeuvre, these performances do entail similar risks to that type of work. It flirts with the pitfalls that more earnest forms of self-disclosing practice perhaps more readily fall into. Harold pre-empts his own typecasting by pointedly living within these roles. His reenactments aren't just indebted to mass media archetypes, but also include taking on the jobs of toilet attendant and doorman and being paid at their standard wages, whilst being an artist in residence. In all cases, his work entails durational feats of endurance that are at once playful and poignant. Through his social practice or community-based work, he often invites audiences to enjoy the same acts of posing he does in his solo work, or of inserting themselves into roles that they were not necessarily meant to play, engaging audiences via a methodology that is antithetical to typecasting, but something decidedly more celebratory and liberating than colorblind casting. I was delighted to learn from a recent podcast interview that when he was afflicted by insomnia as a child, he would end up watching the Open University on telly, which is where he first encountered the pioneering cultural studies professor Stuart Hall. I, too, had the occasional bout of insomnia, but growing up in New York City, this meant watching the Robin Bird show when I was far too young. Brits are just so much classier than us Americans. So we also share the status of being immigrants here in the UK. It's not really a topic that I've addressed personally in my own work, but certainly one that Harold addresses in his. And funnily enough, on the web, we're respectively labeled as being not British artists, but in your case, Harold, Ghanaian, and mine, American, which is just so weird. Like, I don't know how you feel. Maybe that's my first question: is how do you feel when you encounter that? When you self-Google, as we all do, when you see that, are you like, should I somehow get that amend, or do you feel? Yeah, how do you feel about that?
Yeah. Hi, Oriana. What an introduction. Oh, my God.
Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, no, thank you for asking me. Wow, that's just amazing. Yeah, you're right. The Google labeling, yeah, I have thought about that. You're right. I have actually thought, should I get that changed? Because it's, like I don't even have a Ghanaian passport. I mean, I was born there. I mean, I could and I don't have Ghanaian citizenship. But I could get that. So I kind of feel like I'm a bit, for all those Ghanaian artists, many of which I know, they must see that and think, what's he playing at? It's kind of like, it's weird. But in many ways, it's kind of reflective of that kind of sort of, I think that thing of being an immigrant in terms of, where do I sit? How do I identify? How do I articulate my position? Because it's always like, I always feel slightly nervous about the articulation of Britishness. I mean, I am British. I've got a British passport, but so like statehood-wise, but I've got a sort of cultural ambivalence towards identifying myself as that. Partly because of the historical implications of that, but yeah. So that's maybe why I haven't changed it, because I'm just like, I don't know how you feel though with your like.
It's just weird because it's like I'm not. Like, if I have any reputation at all as an artist, it's not in the United States. So it's like, it's just weird because it almost seems to imply she has something that happened in America, and it, like, my artistic career happened entirely here. So yeah, that's just the only thing that feels weird about it, because I feel very American in terms of like nationality. I have an American passport. lived there till I was 21. So yeah, I'm approaching nearly like half my life in the UK. So, but it somehow, even though half my life has been spent here, I still don't feel like, and I have a British passport and everything. I don't feel entitled to claiming Britishness as my identity. But anyway, yeah, Stuart Hall on telly as a child. That must have been great.
Yeah, I mean, I guess at the time I wasn't really thinking about. I was one of these. I was just very curious, I think, as a kid, and I was I mean, it was at this point in the 80s where there weren't many like black people or people of color on British TV anyway. So like, apart from Trevor McDonald, who used to read the ITV news, or Maurice Stewart, who read the BBC news sometimes. So, but when you would see like, black people on TV, it was like a sort of moment. So I think that's why I was like, who is this guy? And he's like, oh, he's like a professor, and I think he also had a very just engaging kind of delivery. There was something about that I just found sort of intriguing. Yeah, but it wasn't, I mean, it makes me sound like some sort of precocious, intelligent. I just was just curious about it. I mean, I would also stay up and watch like shows or sneak down and watch shows that I shouldn't have watched, like, I don't know, sort of dramas or what's Midnight Caller, like these 80s American shows, and Miami Vice and things like that. So it wasn't all like,
I know. I figured as much from the content of your work that, your the input isn't all highbrow.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm curious though about your relationship to the roles that you play in your work. And how, I've put it in a certain way in the introduction, but how would you articulate that relationship? I know it might be different for different projects, but just, I don't know.
I think broadly, these roles are, I mean, in some sense, you might see them as kind of tools or containers or means of kind of exploring certain situations and histories, I think, is what I've come to reconcile them as. I mean, it wasn't necessarily what I saw them as initially when I was sort of first starting as an artist. But maybe, again, it's something linked to kind of childhood in the way that I was very much in my imagination as a kid. So, like, lots of play acting, and I was obsessed with like Dynasty and Dallas, and I'd pretend to be Sue Ellen, and Dominique Devereaux and people like this. But in a way that sort of kids do that, and obviously some adults do that. It's a way of positing yourself in a kind of situation. So it's, to academicize it, it's a kind of methodology in terms of like that idea of trying to kind of think through a narrative or a history or situation by, in a way, situating yourself within it, And I think when I first started, in art school, to finally kind of reconcile, like, how I might go about kind of making art, because I think initially it was, it's like, to make art, I have to, like, there are certain forms that I have to adhere to. And then it wasn't really till the end of art school that I realized, I can just, the things that I really enjoy, like all this kind of like pop culture and like role playing and, I had a bit of a kind of amateur theatre kind of background. All of those things I'd sort of allowed myself to kind of validate as sort of proper kind of tools for really exploring, serious and subjects and areas that had kind of critical weight. So yeah, I think in a lot of the projects, there is this kind of sort of role playing, whether I'm adopting a character or not, or even if I'm kind of facilitating a workshop, I often think that it's a kind of form of role play that is sort of being enacted.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, they're definite like strategies for posing questions and playing, I think, as a way of,
Yeah, I really relate to what you're saying completely. Yeah. There's something in your work and my work that's like reminds me of being getting out the VHS camera as a kid and like doing reenacting a pop video or doing a version of a Greek myth, Medusa or something with my friends or something. I don't know, and I think there's a kind of naive playfulness that's really fun. So it's enjoyable to watch you kind of enjoying yourself doing those things. Were you going to say something?
No, I was just going to say, but I think, the thing for me is that it's always, those things are often kind of dismissed as like, you're just messing about, or like, whereas actually I think that play is really super important, and I think is kind of rooted in like a kind of cultural and intellectual curiosity. Like, I'm sort of really fascinated by the commitment it takes to copy or reenact something, to restage something. Like, there's like an investment in culture, even when kids are kind of doing, I don't know, recreating like a Katy Perry video or whatever it is they might be doing, it's like, there's obviously an attachment and an engagement with that original source, but there's a negotiation of their own situation. So like, how they do the costuming, or, even if they're using like cameras and, how they're setting that up. And I think that often that's just too easily dismissed. And I think, I just think that what that activity represents should be encouraged, because it is about cultural curiosity, and I think we need more of that, not less. And I find how that's just easily dismissed within within sort of cultures that of not having value is sort of really deeply problematic, particularly when there are certain bodies or identities that often lean into that, because it affords them space. So,
Yeah, absolutely. Thinking like, as you said, you kind of played the character, like the female characters on the soap operas that you were watching. And so, I could see that being enabling for you. Could you talk more about that a little bit?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you're right. It was enabling. I think it's just...
how was it responded to, like in your family? And I don't know. Very personal question.
Good question. With this, I mean, there's lots of weird things when I look back at my childhood, because, you know, I mean, my mum's quite young. She had me when I was 19. When she was 19, sorry, not when I was 19. What did I just say? She had me when I was 19.
I understood what you meant.
Oh my Lord. No, she was 19. But I think, I mean, I always thought she was kind of a strict West African Ghanaian mother, you know. But actually looking back on it, she was like super slack, like, you know, and in many ways super, super liberal, because she let me watch all of these shows, and I remember like the primary school that I went to in North London, there were lots of like these middle class white kids, and I would talk about watching these shows. No, we're not allowed to watch that. We got to go to bed at 7. And like, I think, you know, Dynasty and Dallas were on at like 8. So like past people's bedtimes, kind of like, and we would watch the shows together, and she would laugh at me, like pretending to be like, you know, Sue Ellen. And I'd always have like a pretend whiskey glass or something. Like, anyway. So yeah, I don't know. When I look back on it, yeah, there was a kind of maybe a weird permission structure that was kind of created and just, you know, allowing me to kind of do these things. Yeah, but I think all of these things really just fed my imagination, and I think in a way that sort of allowed me later when I went to kind of, you know, kind of secondary school, and again, I'm always really aware of the power of education. I was really super lucky to go to a really liberal, arts-focused, comprehensive school in North London. Like the school that I went to didn't have a school uniform, which is really rare here in the UK. Again, that's not something I was particularly aware of until I speak to, you know, other people, particularly of my generation, who were like, "What? You went to school without uniform?" But I think it was indicative. The school was of a kind of 60s liberal education kind of reforms that happened in a lot of inner city schools, particularly in London. But by the 80s, with Thatcher, had been sort of stripped back. And it's interesting, the school that I went to now does have a uniform, and it's kind of like it's sort of come very much under the Michael Gove reforms.
Yikes.
So I think I was just sort of tracking things back. I think I was fortunate enough to have these structures that allowed and facilitated my creativity and imagination and playfulness. And, you know, I mean, our high school plays that we did were like, we did Bertolt Brecht's Caucasian Chalk Circle, things like that. It's just like, you know, which is kind of super bougie for like, a sort of, you know, a very ordinary kind of like, you know, state school.
So, yeah, I have another question kind of about, you know, the way that playful performance, appropriation, whatever you want to call it, can be dismissed as being not serious. There's another aspect to it that it's not dismissed, but critiqued or maybe considered a bit worrying, like especially when it comes to race. So like or maybe also with gender, like have you faced any, how do you face that issue? Or what are your thoughts about that issue of like cultural appropriation? To go from something really playful to something really heavy, but it's like that really playful thing becomes really heavy when you start to worry about like, am I, you know, is this inappropriate, or am I going to be canceled for this, or I don't know.
Well, I mean, maybe I'll approach it from just my own experience. Like, so I mean, I did this whole body of work about Hattie McDaniel and the Mammy archetype. You know, to be an actor, but to be fixed by you know, just, you know, racism and racial stereotyping, and how she develops this quite pragmatic strategy of, you know, playing within the racial stereotype. and which often led to a lot of criticism of her from, civil rights activists and stuff. And so my way of engaging with that was to take on the stereotype and take on this idea of like how to kind of articulate, that kind of Mammy archetype, which is so entrenched in kind of American culture and stuff. So I was doing this talk at Ohio University, and there was a kind of senior African American painting professor, and he just got super upset. He was like, "Look, you just can't do this. This is, this is part of the African American kind of narrative and story, and you as someone who doesn't share that heritage can't, you don't have a purchase on this." There were people, Black people there who disagreed with him, but I was really aware of that kind of like criticism in terms of, I think, and that, I mention it because I think, his underlying critique was cultural appropriation and the cultural specificity of this material and sensitivity of this material. Mm-hmm. And it was a bit of a wake-up call to me, actually, in terms of really thinking about what are the conditions by which one can engage with a kind of cultural references that maybe exist outside of your immediate experience. And I guess I'd always thought about it through this idea of like, maybe slightly academically, like, like referencing and quoting and respecting the source of the material. You always think about like kind of problematics of cultural appropriation where, things are just kind of like taken and mixed without necessarily giving due knowledge or regard to the kind of history and context in which they come from, and respect as well, in terms of, I think there's also a thing about how that material's kind of sort of handled. And I always thought that I was kind of was aware of that, and that's what I was hoping that I was doing. So it was quite stinging to have someone say, no, you just like, this isn't for you, maybe there are some things that are just, so I think that's kind of stayed with me, really. And
did that put an end to the project, or what do you mean by it stayed with you?
No, it didn't put an end to the project. There were sort of several iterations of it afterwards, and I haven't performed it in a while, a good long while now, maybe like 8 years or something. I still felt even after that a bit ambivalent and kind of, but I kind of felt like somehow, maybe this is naive, but there's a kind of like, through the constant reiterations and playing out, that I'd accrued a set of knowledges and experiences and perspectives kind of on the work. And like I said, that professor's commentary is by no means the dominant from African-American academics or even curators that I've kind of worked with who've been aware of that work, and some have even shown that work as well. So, I guess in some ways, it's easy to kind of say, well, that's just one person's kind of opinion. But I guess it just made me really realize that, often that, how, I guess it's that people's sense of ownership of culture, and I think something that I do think about a lot, particularly because we talked about this before, I do reference a lot of American culture and African-American culture a lot in my work. And, and obviously that's not my heritage, and that's a very particular, specific history. So, yeah, I'm sort of kind of aware about my tangential kind of relationship to that material, but also for me as well, and not the Mammy project, I'm talking about other things to do with kind of particularly American and African American culture. It's just like the kind of cultural hegemony of America, which means that, you know, like, you know, growing up in the UK, even, you know, cousins of mine that have kind of grew up in Ghana or in Kenya or whatever, that particularly African American culture is like a kind of hegemonic Black culture, like, and I think I've been thinking about what's my purchase on that. Again, while that has a very specific history, you know, it's still the history that and narratives that have also kind of helped to shape my identity, even outside of the immediacy of being in the US. Sorry, that sounds a bit all kind of very woolly and confused, but I think I'm always still trying to really unpack that, you know, in the way that that I'm sort of aware that maybe I'm thinking through a lot of these projects, my cultural identification and how, for example, my sense of kind of Blackness or masculinity has been framed by like the cultural hegemony of American culture. I think that's what I'm sort of trying to say.
Yes, that's
so
very
that's
succinct.
that
sums it up.
That's kind of my purchase on it, really, and maybe sometimes that will manifest itself as cultural appropriation. I hope not. It's something that find, you know, it's the sort of thing that will keep me up at night. It's like, oh, was that really? Like, is that really doing that? And maybe for some people it will. And there's some aspects of that I don't necessarily know how to kind of combat. So in some ways, I mean, I think, you know, when I'm thinking about, you know, I guess, you know, there's often a discussion about kind of like white appropriation of kind of Black culture or whatever, and you know, that's often, I think people are often very vigilant and in terms of kind of, you know, policing sort of that. It's weird, I had a conversation yesterday with a student about white girls teaching twerking on TikTok and how she was like, what do I do with that, Harold? I was like, and
I can see how you would be the perfect person to come to with that question, though.
Yes. I was happy to receive it, but it was also, yeah, we ended up sharing the material because I was like, well, how are they doing it? Like, what are they, you know, anyway, I'll stop there. I don't know what else to say.
No, because that reminds me of your Snap.
Snap Like a Diva
piece is a video and also a social practice kind of workshop. I think did you instruct people on how to do the Snap or?
Yeah. I mean, that's based on, again, maybe more cultural appropriation. Or
no. But that's what I think is so interesting because with that particular workshop, and you can kind of elaborate on exactly what it entailed, because I will not do as good a job as you will of describing it, but I feel like it's permissive to have you engaging people of various identity positions in an act of cultural appropriation. It's like you're, you know, who you are and enables that, or kind of like liberates it. And I don't know if that's problematic, but yeah, there's something that's freeing. I don't know. Like I wanted to be there and be permitted to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
and actually, I don't think I would have been aware of it as problematic in like whenever you did it. But now, I don't know, maybe because of call out culture being so heightened and these kind of politics being so heightened and fractious. Now I would feel very nervous about it. But I think if I had been in that setting at that time, I would have gladly and been excited about doing it. Anyway, yeah.
Well, I mean, that piece was kind of informed by two things. I mean, so, yeah, Snap Like a Diva is sort of, there's a sequence in the black filmmaker Marlon Riggs' Tongues Untied, which is this like really beautiful, like, kind of like elegy to kind of queerness from the early 90s. Really amazing film. But there's this sequence where he's like sort of breaking down the kind of lexicon of like snapping and its significance in like sort of black gay culture. And it really struck me how sort of pedagogical it was in terms of like this move means this move means this means, and I just thought that'd be really interesting as a kind of workshop, but also an entry point into his practice. And you know, I was just really interested in why he structured it in that way, that was very much about kind of informing the audience about this vernacular like language. And it reminded me, I think, of can't remember what the piece is called, but there's this Adrian Piper piece. I mean, I'm constantly just looking at Adrian Piper anyway, but where she teaches people to disco dance. I can't remember what that work is called, which I like, which was one of these works at art school that actually made me realize it's like, oh fuck, I can just like you can do a work that uses disco and like you know popular culture and kind of like and that work, you know, the kind of dynamics of that work, you know, where she was basically teaching white people to disco dance and again, I kind of thought was really interesting in terms of how it posited participants into a relationship or a conversation with black culture. But I think I was very aware of starting it out by showing a clip of the film and really like speaking to like, you know, like this comes from a particular place that none of us are kind of particularly accessing, but you know, I guess in a way, like maybe a lot of my things it's very naive sort of fanboy, but it's kind of like this is kind of there's a rich cultural language and referencing that is emerging out of this particular time and this particular kind of culture that I think deserves to be explored and kind of engaged with. You know, it's kind of like, I don't know. It's like, I mean, maybe a culture, a sort of a weird, bizarre equivalence is like, do I have access to like, Heidegger, who's like, a sort of German white, problematic philosopher, but. Or Derrida, or any of those other kind of like.
But you kind of, engaging with that doesn't mirror, or does it mirror the wider kind of social, or the wider, I don't know what's the word I'm looking for, racial bias. It's like structural racism. Which means that, reverse racism doesn't exist, right? So because your appropriation of their work wouldn't be mirroring the structure of racism, the wider structure, therefore it's okay. Like that's not a problematic appropriation at all.
I just need to work on my Heidegger performance workshop, I think. In drag.
You heard it here first.
It's coming.
I hope the curators are listening. So I talked in the introduction about how your work doesn't entail like confessional kind of self-disclosure, or kind of a statement of like claiming an identity. It's playing with pre-existing archetypes and mythologies. So like, is that a like conscious choice or strategy, or like do you how do you feel about like a more confessional practice? Like, is there a reason why you wouldn't engage with it, or do you like any of it, or
I mean, I definitely like it. I mean, I like. I just don't know. It's a mixture of never thinking whether I have anything that interesting to say that kind of emerges from my. As a mate, and also conversely, perhaps not being brave enough to kind of do that. But it's that there's certainly that mode of the kind of confession. It's incredibly powerful, and I'm like super drawn to kind of works like that. Also, possibly as well because like at art school, I was always sort of told that kind of work wasn't really very valid. Just the kind of sort of like myth of objectivity, like it was too subjective, it was too personal. You can't make it too personal. So for me, there's something really like transgressive about like somebody's just really going for it, and using that kind of like personal history and biography as a way of articulating or speaking to either wider social kind of histories or emotions or psychological states. Like I think it's an incredible mode. But yeah, I mean, I think perhaps I'm just sort of like I have then just a need for a bit more kind of distancing, perhaps.
Yeah, I get that impression. Like, yeah, there's like kind of. I never thought of it as maybe not brave enough to do it. I never would have like assumed that would be your answer. But yeah, there are just a sense of like wanting to maintain a level of privacy, or just I think it's quite funny the idea that I don't know, like my life's not that interesting to make art out of. But yeah, also it sounds like maybe listening to those prohibitions or taking them on, like even though you might think that work is brave or want to watch it, but kind of having a sense of I was told not to do that. I mean, not that you're just kowtowing.
It is weird. Like I feel like I'm still unpacking a lot of my art school experiences. Like still now, thinking, it's. I mean, that's and unraveling kind of things that were said or kind of orthodoxies at the time that were like regulated how I might have made work. So, yeah.
I think this is what I want to say about it. It's like in your work, I feel like your appearance plays like the disclosing role, or it's almost like I don't know if ruse is the right word, or it's like a surface onto which the audience projects things. Like in the piece that you did in Brazil, it's people assumed you were Brazilian. And yeah, so it's like I feel like your work plays a lot with the expectations that others have of you based on your appearance, as opposed to you confronting people with the reality of your life, and the reality of your identity. It's about this, the expectations and playing with them and affronting them, or in different works it plays out different ways. Like that really early video with the self-help stuff, it's like your identity plays such a big role in like the understanding of that work, and raises questions about like who that material that you're referencing, like self-help kind of material, who's that for, and what does it mean to be maybe not the target audience for it, but still trying to engage with it. Anyway, not really a question. but please respond in some way.
Yeah, well, it's just I was just thinking about those two works really. The Harold work, which I made in Brazil, and 4 Ways to Feel Amazing. Yeah, I mean,
FYI, those of you listening, you can find out more about these works on Harold's amazing website, haroldoffeh.com. Is that right?
yes, that's right.
It's a really great website.
thank
Sorry. That's another podcast. Artist websites.
Thank you.
I might be doing a spin-off of Multiple O's, which is a spin-off of the O Show. And I might, spin off again into artist websites. Let's talk about those.
There's some really good ones. My favourite at the moment, while just we're on the subject, is Sondra Perry's.
I haven't
Sondra Perry's.
Write a note.
It's really beautiful. Like, you open it up and it's just got this like little video of like these amazing silver false nails on a trackpad, just like moving. And she's got like a little message. Basically, I'm paraphrasing, like, I hope you're well. Like, I hope, it's just really beautiful. And then it unpacks and unfolds. But yeah, that's the website I want at the moment. But I'm obsessed with artist websites actually. So you could invite me back for that.
All right.
That spin-off show.
Aces.
I suppose I should get back to my work. I was just really thinking, I was laughing when you were talking about that, particularly the Harold work, because that, I think, really, I did a residency in 2003 in Rio de Janeiro, which is extraordinary, with Gasworks. And I think that really just changed my life. It's like, in that, I mean, it was just obviously a really amazing opportunity to experience this different culture, but I think just in the way that particularly travel does, but also kind of particularly an international residency, in terms of just reframing my sense of self. And the reason I made that Harold piece is because it just really defined my like whole experience of being in Rio and being misidentified. But like, I've never been misidentified as a native.
Yeah.
And I kept just having these really absurd encounters, including just this really crazy situation where I was like having an argument with this old Brazilian woman in a supermarket, and she wouldn't believe that I wasn't from, there's this area of Brazil called Bahia, which is where a lot of African slaves were. So it's the kind of home of kind of Afro-Brazilian culture. Salvador de Bahia is I think has the biggest black population outside of Africa as a city. It's kind of like, bigger than Atlanta, bigger than, it's kind of like, it's kind of huge. And she thought I was from and she wouldn't believe me. And I was like, but I can't speak Portuguese. I was saying to her, I can't speak. And she was like, what? I think she thought I was somebody that she knew, or she was like.
But was she speaking to you in English?
No, in Portuguese.
How did you know what she was saying?
Well, because she kept on saying, Baiana, Salvador, blah, 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 blah. And she kept mentioning people's names, like Fernando de Seville. I was like, I don't know that. I don't know. She's like, no. And she kept doing this thing about my face. She's like, Baiana. I was like, I don't know. It's like, and then I said Ghana, and she said, Ghana? Oh, okay. Oh. But she still was like super scared. Anyway, it was just freaky. And I'm like, I'm trying to convince somebody that I'm not a native. This is weird. Like, I'm just so used to being kind of like othered that I'm not, the idea of being nativized, I don't even know what the word is sort of like, and I think it was one of the first occasions in which I mean, actually, this goes back to the start of the show where I realised actually how British I was. Like, all the time, I just was like, oh my God. Just like through just micro things like, there's like a whole different relationship to touching and sensuality in Brazil. Like, people are like super handsy, but not in a creepy way. I mean, just like sort of, you know, a stranger, if they're talking to you, they'll put their hand on your shoulder as a way of, and I'd just be like, oh, okay. It's kind of like all the time, being like some really uptight, like, so yeah, I think, so the work really became a way of kind of trying to kind of engage with this sense of kind of dislocation in terms of like, and obviously Brazil has this, massive kind of like, if you talk about African American culture, but Afro-Brazilian culture is, and the whole kind of legacy of kind of slavery and racism in Brazil is like, it's seriously fucked up. But yeah, anyway, so I think that work for me, I think really allowed me to really think through also my relationship in terms of positing myself in relation to these wider cultural histories, thinking through my own personal and social, even political kind of investment in like my identity, my my sense of self, my sense of like, because I was kind of thinking, where do I actually belong? Like with this kind of like,
yeah, I can kind of relate to that, because when I'm in New York, I suddenly feel very British. Like I'm like, where's the queue? Or I'm like, I can't possibly interrupt those people, or what? I just become very, very polite and unassuming. But in London, like I'm the first person to get into an argument or be aggressive on the bus. It's like it's just just an effect of, I don't know, being out of place or feeling out of place, but within one's own context that comes from being.
That's brilliant.
Anyway,
I love that. Yeah, sorry, you also mentioned 4 Ways to Feel Amazing as well, which is a kind of, which again was sort of me kind of performing to these self-help texts. For some reason, I'd received a lot of these self-help texts at one point. Maybe people just gave them to me as gifts. Maybe I've been projecting.
You thought you needed to help yourself?
I think so. It's a point of crisis. And I just became really obsessed with like the language of them and the way that there's a kind of like, there's a kind of sense of sort of distilled, like really distilled and diluted kind of philosophy. So like taking like a kind of Buddhist practice and distilling it into something that was like, but also I think for me, it was always this thing about how individuated everything was. So it was like your personal responsibility to heal yourself. You're the only one, which is obviously true. You do have agency. It's really, really kind of important. But I sort of kind of felt like it was really kind of in the same way that I feel a little bit about mindfulness. I recently made a work about sort of mindfulness. That in a way, there's a kind of like this weird and problematic negation of the need for structural change. Like, so like, like all these things become really super corporatized. So it's your, personal responsibility to
make mindfulness.
Yeah.
There's a book called Make Mindfulness.
Yeah. To make yourself kind of happy, or to make yourself, whereas actually maybe you just need a pay rise because, you're working too much. Like maybe it's like a structural issue with like,
exactly.
But the emphasis is always on like, is like being more efficient as a human being. So it's always in like within this sort of like capitalist kind of like rubric of like, labor and efficiency and,
and taking individual responsibility for your own well-being, as opposed to expecting society to play a bigger part in your well-being.
Whereas like, we need society to kind of like, maternity and paternity leave, these are huge things that will affect people's sense of well-being. but they're like state responsibilities. I mean, maybe breathing and meditating for 10 minutes might help, but it doesn't negate that structural issue that will really affect people, So it's just, I mean, I think in both those kind of sort of works, I was really trying to think through the problematics of like the over focus on the individual and like, anyway, yeah.
They're very different.
They are.
They're very, very different, but they're about what connects them is something to do with your appearance and people's reactions to it in different contexts, or what this kind of bringing together of your personhood with a context in which you don't belong, or assume to not belong, or assume to belong in the case of Brazil, and then assume not to belong in the case of like that self-help.
Yeah, I think a lot of what I'm doing is basically sort of like, in a way, literally trying to materialize some of those concepts or ideas through my presence in a particular context. So with the self-help things, it was like, okay, just illustrating the kind of like, is sort of using myself as a kind of, in a way, illustration or visualization, actualization, maybe that's a better word, of, some of these ideas, and to sort of highlight the kind of absurdity, I hope, or the kind of disjuncture between, often what's trying to be articulated and the actuality of someone embodying some of these things. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you, as a kind of aside, do you read any self-help, or do you engage with self-help like at all? Like you said, people gave you those things, so it's not something you're seeking out. It's not something you engage. Is it something you ever engage with? You ever buy a self-help book?
I have. I mean, after I was given a couple, 40 ways to feel amazing. And then I became really interested in them, so I started to buy them because I really wanted to kind of, particularly the bite-sized ones that were just like, your kind of daily, you can just do one a day. It's partly just a way of really thinking through, how they were kind of constructed and articulated.
Did any of them particularly work for you that you went on to recommend to other people?
Not really.
Recommended reading.
No, essential reading. No, not really. I'm never very good at keeping up sort of regimes of things, Well,
you have in your work regimes of making art you've kept up with quite well.
Yeah, I just mean exercise or yoga or breathing, or I've been trying to breathe. I have an app that tells me to breathe every 2 hours, and it has a kind of a pulsing. I just found it on the App Store. So it'll get I'll get a little notice on my computer, like, time to breathe, Harold. And then you've got to take a minute, and it has different breath, that kind of thing. But it does different rhythms. Okay, it's not just breathing in and out you might sort of normally do. So, but yeah, we'll see. It's probably just a novelty. I'll probably give it up.
That's fascinating. Yeah. So, yeah. Oh, because that's ringing bells. It's ringing rather unhappy bells.
Oh. I haven't triggered,
to do
I
with
hope.
Breathing. No, not triggered. No, don't worry about it. It's maybe I should give you a trigger warning about what I'm about to bring up. No, I don't. Oh, yes, leads to the question, actually, which is, do you ever get the criticism about your work that you're dealing with race and sexuality and identity politics, but you're not facing the dark stuff? You're not I've had that criticism. When I did this event at the Tate in 2009, it was a feminist celebratory reenactment event, and I got the in some of the feedback was like, where was the sexual assault? Where was the domestic violence? Maybe I should have put a trigger warning on that. But it was like this, where was the darker, I don't know, topics that feminism is expected to address. So, do you ever get that? Like,
I don't know if I probably have, but I've certainly not had it articulated in the way that you're describing. But I could definitely see people applying that to my work. But I find that such a really weird, like, critique. Because to me, that kind of, I'd just be like, that says so much about you. I mean, it's kind of, okay, well, I don't know. Well, I mean, that's just so deeply problematic in terms of a call for the work to be...
You, as this identity category, have an obligation to deal with, maybe the worst things that happen to that.
I mean, obviously, there's a space for that. And we I think... and, I engage with works that kind of deal with that. And for me, those underlying narratives and resonances are kind of sort of there. But, I mean, I guess I've sort of consciously, unconsciously chosen not to, foreground that stuff. But I don't see why there's this idea that, should prescribe that work that, engages with race or gender or, engages with like feminist discourse should sort of have to articulate it through trauma and violence. I find that really deeply problematic in terms of like, I just want to speak to the person that asked that and be like,
well, it was. I don't even know if that record has been kept of like that form that was filled in.
But do you know what I mean? I just kind of think, well, okay, that's fine. I mean, okay, you came to the event, but isn't there a space for a number of articulations and approaches? And
I know, but actually, that kind of.
Like, sorry, please.
That just really makes me think about the recent thing with for kids, and I love how you sort of introduce these artworks like by VALIE Export and by David Hammons, and they are the kind of premise for kids at home, families at home to be doing various activities, and that work is those artists work, and they are, feminist, anti-racist, respectively, artists. But the way you present it is completely depoliticized. It's like, this is a fun family activity. There's, even though, like, I love that. Like, that's another affinity we have, is like this kind of relationship to feminist, like second wave feminist artists, as like being sort of models for our practice or being very inspirational to us. And but it's like in that context, the politics is there, but it's also like removed in a sense, and it's just playful.
I think it's a little bit about just different forms of kind of articulation. Like I feel like a lot with those opportunities, it's really just about sometimes it's just about providing access into providing resources and and I realize with I spent ages trying to think about those artists and obviously like VALIE Export, David Hammons, they're like two of my favorite artists and have really shaped my practice. But I also kind of realized the reason I chose them as well is that they're not, obviously they're dealing with kind of, anti-racism and feminist discourses, but it's not only about that. It's like those artists, there are formal aspects about their work.
And that's what that video is about. And it's about taking those formal aspects of the work on their own, on that level, for their own value. It's quite liberating. Again, that's what I want to say about your practice. It's permissive and liberating.
And I just wanted to introduce those works into particularly for children and young people, their kind of lexicon of approaches, because as much as it is about those political discourses, they're also just playing. Like those artists are incredibly like their like formal engagement is super interesting and like, you know, for me, VALIE exporting those works, the way that she's like annotating those buildings or annotating space. I mean, obviously that has a kind of political resonance, but formally it's super really interesting. And I think is also incredibly enabling as a way of engaging with your immediate environment, is to think about how you form shapes or mirror architecture or like, and if that provides a way in for like a young person, to engage with their immediate environment, immediate space, and then the wider resonance of then thinking about the specificity of their body in that space and the political and cultural resonance in that space, then yeah. But for me, it's also just, you know, like I feel like often there are, with certain artists, they just become one note. You know, it's like, oh, they're the feminist artist, and that's what the work is about. It's like, well, no, there's other things going on with that work, you know, like.
And form is one that's notoriously neglected.
Absolutely.
Especially for artists whose work is identity-based.
Exactly. So I just felt that there was an opportunity there, you know, and while I don't go, into the kind of specifics of the kind of political context of their work, you know, I just want people to be aware of those are artists out there, you know, and it's like, if people want to go further and, do the work, and, you know, there are some parents that will do that, others that won't, but, you know, but it's also the idea that there's a kind of currency of those artists' work that operates on various levels that it's important to articulate. I mean, if we're talking about decolonising the curriculum, I think it has to be just like, has to operate at many different levels, and I think it has to be about kind of resourcing and facilitating a whole series of kind of references of artist practices that operate on many different levels and will have different registers and significant impact on those different registers.
I completely agree. I completely agree with what you're saying, but I want to talk more about the connections between your work and feminist precedents, specifically the works you've done to do with labor and your taking on the role of the toilet attendant and the doorman. I don't think the doorman is what you use. The phrase is the term. Is that the job title? That is the job.
Yeah, it's doorman, I think.
Yeah. And my question is to do with, and you did this within the context of a gallery within the Tate Modern, and also what was the actual place that commissioned
it's the David Roberts.
The David
Roberts Foundation.
Yeah. And I'm wondering about, again, this question of, I can see how you learned a lot from those, from taking on that role. And I can see a kind of link between this project of yours of being the toilet attendant and sort of, doing an intervention within the role that is subsidiary to the purpose of the gallery, and like tweaking that role. And I mean, with Mierle, Laderman, Ukeles, which was her manifesto of maintenance art. She turns kind of maintenance acts, or like the kind of roles that a janitor, cleaning person would play. She turns it into art by being an artist and doing that role, which is very different from what you've done. And it's about recognizing those kind of invisible forms of labor. Like that's the link. But yeah, maybe you could talk about, I mean, what were you thinking of her work at all, or was it completely different set of references you're responding to with that? Or you've talked about it as a continuation of the Mammy work in a way. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was, I think because the initial invitation to do the show was linked into showing objects from the Mammy, and then I was thinking about, you know, because the show was called Services Rendered, and I was thinking about other forms of kind of contemporary kind of labour and service culture linked into kind of Mammy, you know, in terms of the, you know, and but yeah, the Ukeles Laderman definitely was a reference. I think when I was then thinking about, and I'd, you know, one of my favourite pieces is Touch Sanitation, which is, you know, where she kind of like,
she shakes the hand.
Shakes the hand of the New York sanitation department kind of workers. And I mean, her whole practice, I think, is just like a kind of really interesting series of kind of strategies and political gestures and actions. And but yeah, so yeah, I had really kind of thought through that thing about the role of the artist playing, and I guess that's something I was also really aware of in going into that work, and the negotiations. I worked with the curator Selena Simmons, who was a freelance curator for the David Roberts Foundation, and instigated that show. And then we negotiated with the Tate access to perform that work. I'm sort of really amazed how they actually just let that happen. But
it's interesting how things like often happen through this weird back channel. Like I really thought the Tate were like fully on board and had like co-commissioned it. I didn't get that. It's interesting how it's like, why wouldn't they want to like? I would think that they would have wanted to claim that as their curatorial. Anyway, whatever. I don't know.
I mean, I really have to thank. It's really down to kind of Catherine Wood, really, because we asked her and she just said, "Yeah, it's fine," and she invited me to do a talk, which I did. You know, she just said it would be really good to contextualize it, so let's do a talk. But yeah, I mean, I don't think there are many big institutional spaces that would allow like an externally initiated project, externally funded project to be enacted in their space. And so I have to huge kudos to her for letting that happen. But yeah, so for me, really, I mean, it's a super speculative work. Like, I think I was really interested in Ukeles Laderman and what did it mean for her to be in these positions, in these roles, and I felt like that work was a kind of connection between sort of performing the Mammy archetype with like a fat suit and in a kind of sort of like costuming, and the Ukeles Laderman work, which is so much about a kind of sort of immersion or positing within a particular kind of social kind of context, and involved real labour as well, you know. And I felt like that was partly bridged by the fact that, like, you know, like my mum was a cleaner, like she did that job.
I was wondering if that was, but I thought like that's a weird question to ask. Like,
no.
What does your mom do? Like, it's just
no. I mean, she's a dinner lady now, so she's kind of like, but like, you know, for a long time, her job was like cleaning hospitals and offices, and as a kid, I used to go with her and help her, and you know, sort of change bins and things like that. So, and obviously, those are the sorts of jobs that kind of immigrants often do. So it, you know. So in some ways, you know, a lot of times I feel like I have to create a permission structure for myself to kind of do these things. And I was a bit ambivalent about that work. And I mean, one of the negotiations for doing that work at the Tate was that I had to do some training, and they asked me to speak to the cleaning team, who was sort of subcontracted, but at the time, a lot of the cleaners at Tate Modern, were from different parts of South America. so from Colombia and somebody from Bolivia, and it was like amazing kind of so I had to talk about what I was doing in the context of, you know, which is really interesting, and I was really grateful for that opportunity to kind of have that conversation. And but then, yeah, so as part of the work, you know, I sort of working in these positions. I had a uniform, and I'd had these kind of sort of this sort of training afternoon, and then I had like the 2 days of performing in situ in the space, which was, yeah, really interesting. I sort of look back at that work and think, oh my God, did I really do that? But it was really, I think, again, a bit like kind of invigilating, like a real interesting study of human behaviors. And I was really aware of how little I did, how little gestures would really affect or shift people's kind of sort of behavior and ways of kind of operating. So yeah, I mean, so I was a stationary toilet attendant at Tate Modern for this work, and which is not a service that they offer. I mean, you know, it's the sort of thing you might get like a I don't know, a sort of club or a high-end hotel or something. And actually, it's so interesting. I think there's, you know, for me, one of the interesting things was because it was at Tate Modern and a lot of the visitors were international. It was really interesting to see how different cultures have different relationships to forms of service. So basically, I stood by the sinks and would offer people paper towels after they washed their hands. And I had like a tip tray. I had like, you know, some hand moisturizer and things like that sort of people could, you know, and I'd clean up after. So yeah, and again, I think that, you know, it's just really aware of how that work, because of the nature of the service, really the power dynamic within that particular work, because people feel perhaps more vulnerable within that situation of being in the toilet, and that actually I actually had quite a lot of power. People were, I mean, and I'm just going to go to speak to the kind of cultural differences. You know, most British people were really super awkward and just like, and either they would see me and deliberately not wash their hands so they didn't have to engage in the whole thing, or they'd be super awkward about, like, you could sort of feel the palpable kind of tension as I and again, I mean, it feels like I'm speaking to cultural stereotypes, but it's interesting. Americans were the ones who were most comfortable with that situation. And I'd say about 75% of the tips that I got were from Americans.
That doesn't surprise me.
You know, and I think that's because there is a kind of service culture in terms of, like, you know, yeah, people doing, you know, those kind of sort of service jobs. And I think people are kind of used to that particular dynamic, and maybe just kind of, you know. And
I want to interject that, like, I would feel incredibly uncomfortable, and I do feel incredibly uncomfortable with bathroom attendants. But I definitely feel the obligation as an American to provide a tip. And actually, I encountered a bathroom attendant in Florida last year, at, of all places, like in a place in Miami where there's a lot of street art. Like they have a display of graffiti art, like commissioned kind of murals. And there's a restaurant there. And yeah, I went in to just like take my kid to the toilet or something. And I didn't have my wallet or anything. And there was a toilet attendant, and I was like, Anyway, I don't know why I'm telling this anecdote. It's really not that interesting. But no, yeah, I just want to say that, like, Americans might give the tip but still feel awkward, and you may not even be reading the awkwardness for them. Like, I think they may be better at hiding it.
Yeah, no, I mean, you that's a really kind of good point about, yeah, the awkwardness, but it's also just things like eye contact and sort of like, and also like often it was, these American patrons, the ones that sort of said, how are, the courtesies or things, or
Yes.
like if I had conversations, it would be people, so that became kind of really interesting, I think, and sort of really kind of marked a lot of, I think the difficulty for me was like, how do you, beyond that kind of personal experience, the personal kind of, some ways felt like being a method actor or something,
You know what it is? It's like participant observation. It's like an anthropological study.
Yeah.
But yeah, again, that produces knowledge for the people outside of it, outside of that role. So like you gained experience of being in the role, and the audience, maybe some of them understood it was, or I think you said one person knew, kind of asked you if it was a performance. So some were a little bit savvy about the fact they were participating in a social experiment in a sense. And others were oblivious and just having to, live through this awkwardness or this cultural experience. What does it do? Like you had to have this training and discussion with the staff, but what does that work really do for the people who have to do those jobs, like, or, as you're saying, your own mother does those jobs. Incidentally, I have myself looked into becoming a dinner lady because part of me thought, like, I spent so many hours preparing to be an art lecturer. Like, by the time I finish that all, I'm probably earning minimum wage. So, like, dinner lady hours would fit better in with my picking up my kids and stuff. So I'm like, maybe I should just switch to that. And, like, I'd probably earn the same amount of money. I don't know. Actually, maybe it'd be slightly less. But I have thought about that as, like, another avenue for employment. Which kind of, so I want to ask you firstly about, like, what does it do for, what does it do? Or what were you hoping it would do for them? Or did you have any ambitions, like, towards low-wage workers, like, with the work? Invisible workers.
Yeah, if perhaps not directly. I didn't necessarily think, oh, this is kind of, this is about, in the time that I was doing it, oh, this is about making that invisible work visible in that way. I guess I would have felt that that's a bit of a sort of like bombastic kind of like gesture, but that's perhaps one of the effects of the work. I guess for me, I was very much focused on the idea of less a kind of commentary on the people that really have to do that work every day and are sort of really intimate with all the weird dynamics and the sort of like politics of operating in that space, and more really trying to materialize that for the kind of customers or audience, the people that, So, I think it was less focused on the people that do the job and more on, service users, really.
Yeah.
And really speaking to the dynamics of that experience and that work led to because I was interested in like these performing toilet attendants who like sing, and there's all these amazing YouTube videos. I say amazing, they're so weird, of these like toilet attendants in Spain or in holiday resorts or sometimes in the UK in clubs in Essex and stuff. And they all tended to be like sort of like, African immigrants. And in order to generate more tips, they'd come up with these songs, like, like misogynistic songs for like getting tips out of these drunk guys, sort of sexy kind of like, and so they kind of will perform to these sort of drunk teenagers, guys in their 20s, and sort of generate I just sort of reminded me of minstrelry. I was like, oh, right, this is kind of...
Yes, that's what it is like.
I was like, this is, okay. Like a weird... So they were doing like these weird self-parodying and like, these guys from like Nigeria and Senegal and Ghana, and they're singing this Punani song, so like Jamaican patois, and it's like, this is like, what is this? This whole like, and yeah, so that was a subculture that was, and a couple of times
little,
I took that on as a
tiny little facet of cultural production, the performance of being a toilet attendant.
Yeah,
it's such a weird phenomenon. I can understand like the attraction to investigating that, but yeah, it's interesting to hear you articulate that it is very much more about like being the recipient of those things, but it makes me think about the wider, like you're talking about the fact that the cleaning staff at the Tate were primarily South American immigrants. And like, if you think about that in contrast to the curatorial staff, for example, like they would not be coming from there. I mean, obviously it's a very difficult thing to actually implement structural change. Like that would probably entail like asking people to give up their jobs on the basis of their politics, or which most people won't do or can't do. Or yeah. Anyway, it's these are the kinds of things I ended up thinking about from thinking about your work. So I think that's quite good.
I'm happy. That's good.
You're happy. Good. I'm glad.
I'm happy.
I'm glad I'm making you happy. But yeah, thank you so much for being so generous with your time and your responses. And it's been really amazing and fascinating, and gives me loads of things to think about.
Thank you. Great to talk to you, Oriana. Yay.
I hope you enjoyed that lengthy and rich discussion between Harold Offeh and I. It really was lovely speaking with him, and we did talk for a very, very long time. That is an edited version of our discussion. I promise you. I cut things. I really did. It was hard to cut anything else, though.
Next week on Multiple O's. Next
time on Multiple O's, I'll be speaking with none other than Lois Weaver, who has been mentioned not once, but twice on prior episodes of this very podcast, because she is an extremely influential figure in the field of performance art. So until then, be sure to accept yourselves unconditionally, and others. We're all just fallible human beings.